It's a peculiar thing how much of a person's struggle can remain completely unseen, especially when that person is a woman. And it's not because she's hiding it necessarily, or because there's nothing to see, but because she's been conditioned not to show it. That's the tragedy. The most grueling battles are fought in silence, behind smiles, behind responsibilities. Not because it's easy, but because she's learned that breaking down costs more than holding everything together. There's this phrase, emotional labor. You've probably heard it tossed around, but most people don't really stop to think about what it actually means. It isn't just about being nice. It isn't just about being polite or empathetic. It's about absorbing the emotional turbulence of a household, a workplace, a relationship, without any acknowledgement that it's happening at all. It's about being the one who anticipates needs before they're spoken, who manages conflict without escalation, who holds the pieces together when no one else notices they're falling apart. And here's where it becomes a psychological trap. Because the more competent a woman becomes at carrying this invisible load, the more invisible it becomes. Her composure becomes her curse. She isn't praised for it, she's expected to sustain it. She becomes the emotional scaffolding for everyone around her, while her own pain is quietly dismissed, minimized, or flat out ignored. You'll hear women say things like, "I just have to get through this week," or "I can't fall apart, not right now." What they're really saying is, I've internalized the belief that my pain is a burden, so I'll swallow it for the sake of everyone else. That's not strength in the traditional sense. It's martyrdom masquerading as resilience. And over time, it corrodes the soul. It separates a person from their own needs, their own voice. That's not just unfortunate, it's dangerous. Because if you don't know where your boundaries are, you become prey to those who don't respect them. Now imagine this compounding across years, across decades, across generations. You inherit a script without even realizing it. Be agreeable, be nurturing, don't complain, don't need too much, and above all, don't inconvenience anyone. That is the invisible curriculum women have been forced to memorize. But let's look at it more deeply, philosophically. What does it mean to be burdened with responsibility that isn't seen? It means that you live in a kind of double reality. One where you appear composed, competent, perhaps even admired, and another internal world where you're exhausted, depleted, sometimes on the verge of collapse. The dissonance between those two worlds is psychologically destabilizing. And yet most women are navigating that split without anyone ever asking, "Are you okay?" So what's the cost? The cost is spiritual erosion. It's losing the ability to trust your own emotional signals because you've spent years overriding them. It's living in chronic hypervigilance, constantly anticipating the next crisis, the next emotional outburst, the next thing that you will be expected to manage. And let me tell you, that kind of psychological stress doesn't just disappear. It lodges itself in the body. It becomes anxiety, autoimmune issues, insomnia, chronic fatigue. Your biology starts to scream what your voice has been forced to suppress. And yet, and this is crucial, within that burden lies a particular kind of power. Because once you see the invisible load for what it is, you're no longer unconsciously enslaved to it. You begin to ask, whose expectations am I living under? Who benefits from my silence? What parts of myself have I muted to be acceptable, agreeable, digestible to others? Awareness is the beginning of liberation. And make no mistake, it is a revolutionary act for a woman to name her exhaustion, to articulate her unmet needs, and to refuse to be the container for everyone else's emotional chaos. This isn't about abandoning compassion. It's about distinguishing between compassion and compliance. It's about recognizing that love does not require self-erasure, that being the strong one doesn't mean being the silent one, and that dignity is not measured by how much you can endure quietly, but by how honestly you can live with yourself. Let me tell you what starts to happen when a woman stops carrying the invisible load alone. The room shifts. The people around her are forced to confront their own dependence on her emotional labor. Some will resist, some will punish, because when someone who's always made life easier suddenly stops, it reveals just how much they were doing. But this confrontation is necessary. It forces accountability. It forces maturity. It also allows new possibilities to emerge. She begins to speak more directly. She sets firmer boundaries. She asks for help, and in doing so, she models a deeper form of strength, not one built on silence, but one rooted in self-respect. And I would argue this is the kind of strength the world desperately needs. Not performative strength, not stoicism masquerading as control, but the strength to live in alignment with your own truth, even if it inconveniences the expectations of others. So if you are a woman or someone who knows a woman carrying this invisible load, I want you to remember this. You are not weak for feeling tired. You are not selfish for needing space. You are not dramatic for wanting to be seen. You are human, and you are allowed to put the weight down, because the world will only begin to change when those carrying it stop doing so in silence. And in that silence, start speaking clearly, courageously, and without apology. There's something remarkably misunderstood about solitude. People conflate it with loneliness, with alienation, with defeat. But solitude is not the absence of connection, it's the foundation of it. It is in solitude that you discover whether your inner world can sustain you, or if you're simply a product of other people's expectations. Many women walk this path alone, but not broken. Alone, but deeply anchored in something most people have never dared to confront: themselves. You see, our culture is obsessed with external validation. Likes, followers, being seen, being approved of. It's a dopamine-soaked game, one that rewards conformity far more than truth. And for women in particular, that game is ruthless. You're expected to be nurturing but not needy, independent but not intimidating, beautiful but not vain, and heaven forbid you choose solitude over codependence, because then you're suddenly cold, unapproachable, too much, or even worse, not enough. But here's the paradox: the strongest people you'll ever meet are often the ones who've walked through hell alone and didn't scream for attention while doing it. Why? Because they've learned something most people haven't. That when you strip away the noise, when you remove the external scaffolding of constant feedback, you find out who you actually are. Not who you were told to be, not who you became to avoid rejection, but who you are at the core, underneath the performance. This is not just a psychological process, it's a philosophical reckoning. It forces you to ask, can I endure my own company without distraction? Can I tolerate my thoughts long enough to make peace with them? And perhaps most importantly, can I trust myself enough to navigate this world without depending on the constant affirmation of others? Now, this kind of solitude is not passive. It's not about retreating from life. It's about stepping back so that when you return to the world, you're not doing it out of desperation. You're doing it from alignment. A woman who can sit with herself and not flinch is a dangerous woman in the best possible sense, because she cannot be manipulated with guilt. She cannot be seduced by shallow praise. She cannot be bullied into submission by people who mistake her silence for weakness. And this terrifies those who benefit from her compliance. In a world that tries to tell women they are only valuable in relation to others, as mothers, as partners, as supporters, choosing solitude becomes a revolutionary act. It says, I am enough, even if no one claps for me. I am valid, even if no one sees me. That's not arrogance. That's sovereignty. And it takes courage, because when you detach from the roles that earned you approval, you will be tested. People will say you've changed. They'll call you distant or difficult. But what they're really saying is, I don't know how to relate to you now that you no longer bend yourself to make me comfortable. But here's the thing. Comfort is not the same as truth. And if your presence only feels safe when you're small, then that presence is being rented, not respected. True solitude teaches you to stop renting your energy to people who don't know how to pay. In loyalty, in respect, in emotional maturity, it sharpens your discernment. It clarifies your values. It shows you who belongs in your life and who merely wanted to use your light without ever tending to their own. This kind of clarity doesn't make you invulnerable, but it makes you harder to fool. And that's what unbreakable really means. Not that you'll never hurt, not that you won't feel grief or longing, but that no matter what comes, you won't betray yourself just to make others feel secure. We live in a time where everyone's told to connect. to network, to build relationships. And while none of that is inherently bad, it becomes toxic when people are told they're incomplete without constant relational stimulation. Solitude then becomes a threat to a culture that profits off of insecurity. But strength, true strength, requires solitude. Because without solitude, your thoughts are always borrowed, your standards are imported, your sense of self is outsourced. The woman who is calm in solitude, who doesn't panic in silence, who finds meaning in the stillness of her own mind, that woman is not to be pitied. She is to be respected because she has walked through the storm of social expectations and found shelter not in another person, but in herself. That's the secret high achievers rarely talk about. Not the hustle, not the tactics, but the psychological stamina to be alone with their thoughts and not crumble. That's what creates vision. That's what cultivates purpose. That's what gives a person the strength to act when no one is watching. And this isn't just an idea for philosophers or monks. This is for every woman who's ever sat in her car and cried so no one would see. For every woman who's carried her own chaos in silence because she didn't want to burden anyone else. For every woman who's had to rebuild herself without a cheerleading squad or a support group or even a single voice telling her, "You're going to make it." Because if you're sitting in solitude right now, wondering if your strength means anything in a world obsessed with appearances, know this: the roots grow in the dark. The woman who can be alone and still rise is not broken. She's becoming. And no one, not the world, not your past, not even your fear, can take that from you. Resilience is often misunderstood. We picture it as this dramatic act of defiance, shouting into the storm, charging into the fire, making some grand statement that the world can't ignore. But more often than not, real resilience doesn't look like that. It's not flashy, it's not loud, it's the quiet refusal to break again and again, even when no one is watching, even when it would be easier, far easier, to give in. It's in those small, invisible moments that resilience is forged. The moments when a woman wakes up with the weight of everything on her shoulders: grief, pressure, financial stress, emotional exhaustion, and still chooses to face the day. No applause, no spotlight, just the decision: I will not collapse today. There's a paradox buried in strength that no one tells you about, especially when you're a woman. It's this: the stronger you are, the more alone you often become. That sounds counterintuitive at first. After all, we admire strength, we applaud it, we celebrate resilience, independence, composure on the surface. But beneath the applause, something else quietly unfolds. The strong become expected to carry more, and not just physically or logistically, but emotionally, existentially. People stop asking if you're okay. They assume you are because you don't fall apart in front of them. They interpret your steadiness as surplus, not survival. They assume your silence is peace, not discipline. Your calm is comfort, not composure under fire. And because you don't show the cracks, they assume there aren't any. This is the isolation of strength. It's being the person everyone relies on while having no one to rely on yourself. It's being the one who listens, who comforts, who solves while your own needs go unmet, not out of malice, but because people forget strong people have needs at all. And for women, this becomes doubly complicated because there's this unspoken social script that says strength in a woman should be soft, nurturing, endlessly available, but never demanding, never assertive, never visibly burdened. So when a woman dares to embody true psychological fortitude, she's often misread. People don't know where to place her. She becomes threatening to some, inconvenient to others, and invisible to many. This is especially true in environments where emotional labor is expected to be a woman's default mode of interaction. When she refuses to be an emotional dumping ground, when she establishes boundaries, when she speaks clearly instead of cushioning the truth, suddenly she's cold or intimidating or too much. And so, slowly but surely, the strong woman is pushed to the margins, not because she's done something wrong, but because her presence disrupts the comfortable illusions others live in. Her strength demands others grow up, take responsibility, stop outsourcing their regulation, and most people aren't ready for that. There's a loneliness that comes with this kind of strength, a loneliness that isn't loud but constant. It's not the loneliness of isolation from people necessarily. It's the loneliness of not being seen, of being surrounded but misunderstood, of being valued for what you can provide but rarely for who you are. And yet, and here's where the philosophical depth of this truly sets in, it is in that solitude that something sacred is formed. In that space where you're left alone, a choice emerges. You can either become bitter or you can become refined. You can curse the burden of your strength, or you can let it carve you into something precise and indestructible. Because there's a reason why strong people are often left standing alone. It's not just society's fault. It's not just neglect. It's that strength exposes weakness, and weakness resents the mirror. Your ability to endure without complaint, to speak without flinching, to act without permission. It reflects back to others their own compromise, their own dependency, their own fear. And rather than confront that, many will withdraw. That's not on you, but it is yours to navigate. And that navigation, it demands depth. You can't do it with superficial platitudes. You can't survive it with fake positivity or performative empowerment. You need philosophy. You need meaning. You need a vision of yourself that reaches beyond the transactional, beyond approval, beyond being liked. You need to know who you are when no one is clapping. And when you get there, when you really get there, you become untouchable in the best way. Not numb, not detached, but sovereign. Capable of connection, but not desperate for it. Able to serve others, but not enslaved to their expectations. Willing to be alone because you refuse to betray yourself for company. That kind of strength, it's not just rare, it's revolutionary. And yes, it will still hurt, it will still get lonely, but you'll find yourself walking among a different kind of person. People who've chosen solitude over conformity. People who've been tested and didn't shatter. People who see your strength not as a resource to extract, but as a mirror of their own. That's when the isolation begins to transform not into belonging exactly, but into alignment. You begin to attract those who aren't afraid of your strength, who don't need you to shrink, who meet you as equals, not as projects. But that only happens after you've made peace with standing alone, after you've stared down the silence and said, I'll still stand. And so, if you're there now, if you're feeling the weight of being the strong one, of being the one others forget needs help too, know this. Your solitude is not a sign of your failure. It is the cost of your authenticity. And it is in that solitude that your true self is born. There's something deeply noble about that kind of strength. It isn't about pretending everything is okay. It's not about never crying, never struggling, never feeling lost. It's about continuing in spite of all of it, about choosing integrity over ease, even when ease would feel like salvation. And yet, this kind of quiet resilience is often overlooked, especially in women. Why? Because it doesn't fit the narrative. Society often rewards noise. It notices the extremes, the breakdowns, or the breakthroughs. But the woman who silently bears the unbearable, she becomes invisible. People see her functioning, so they assume she's fine. They don't see the discipline it takes to carry pain with grace. They don't see the 1,000 internal negotiations she makes just to keep going. And when you're not seen, it's easy to start doubting your own strength. You begin to wonder if what you're doing matters, if your endurance, your persistence, your sacrifices are making any difference at all. Let me say this clearly, they are. Because every time you choose not to break, when you could, when maybe even part of you wants to, it changes you. Not in the way trauma changes you, but in the way character is built, slowly, relentlessly, quietly, from the inside out. You become less reactive, more composed, not because you're numb, but because you've learned that panic solves nothing, and self-control is its own kind of armor. And here's the thing, resilience doesn't mean you never fall. It means you learn to fall better, to land without shattering, to get up without bitterness, to continue forward without needing validation every step of the way. Philosophically, this is a kind of stoicism, not the rigid suppression of emotion, but the disciplined orientation of the soul toward what is within your control. You don't get to choose your suffering, not always, but you get to choose what you do with it. You get to choose your response. And in that space, in that gap between pain and action, lies your freedom. And I'll tell you something else. People notice. They might not say it. They might not compliment your restraint or your self-possession, but they feel it. They sense that there's something unshakable in you. And for those who thrive on chaos, for the manipulators, the narcissists, the energy vampires, that kind of resilience is intimidating because it means they can't control you. They can't bait you into their drama. They can't destabilize you with emotional volatility. You become immune to cheap power plays because your center is not negotiable. But don't expect the world to celebrate you for this. In fact, it might try to punish you. It might call you cold, difficult, unfeminine, too strong. But those labels are projections. They're attempts to diminish what cannot be dominated. Your quiet strength challenges the systems that feed on emotional compliance, and that makes you dangerous in all the right ways. Now, I know it's hard. Being resilient can feel isolating. You get tired of being the strong one. You long for someone to say, I see you. You want softness, rest, reprieve. That's human. You're not weak for craving connection. You're human for wanting to be held. But just because you're walking alone doesn't mean you're unloved. And just because you're not falling apart doesn't mean you're not healing. There's a difference between silence and surrender, between being alone and being defeated. Resilience is what bridges that difference. It's the choice to keep your values intact, your dignity preserved, even when everything around you is eroding. It's not glamorous. It won't trend on social media, but it will give you something no one can ever take from you: self-respect. Because at the end of the day, when the noise dies down and the lights go out and it's just you and your own conscience, you'll know that you stayed upright when life tried to flatten you. That's not small. That's everything. And to the women living this daily, often silently, often without recognition, don't ever underestimate the magnitude of what you're doing. You are carrying a weight most people don't even realize exists. And you're doing it with grace. So don't apologize for your strength. Don't soften your edges for people who haven't earned your softness. And never ever confuse silence with weakness, because some of the most powerful revolutions begin not with a shout, but with a whisper that says, I will not break today. One of the most disturbing dynamics in our culture is that women who suffer in silence are often rewarded, and those who speak out, who draw boundaries, who say enough, are frequently punished. Now, we don't say this explicitly, of course. No one walks around announcing that women should be quiet and compliant, but it's encoded in how society reacts to female strength, and more importantly, to female discomfort. We reward the woman who takes on more than her share of work, of emotional labor, of pain, and does it with a smile. We call her strong, nurturing, even graceful under pressure. We pedestal her. But if that same woman stops smiling, if she begins to say, no, this is too much, or I won't accept this, then suddenly the admiration turns. She becomes difficult, abrasive, or emotional. And that shift reveals something very telling. Society doesn't reward her strength. It rewards her silence. Now, why is that? Why is a woman's endurance more palatable than her assertiveness? Why is pain, so long as it's hidden, treated as virtue, while open resistance is treated as threat? The answer, I believe, lies in our cultural relationship to discomfort. Most people don't want to confront suffering. They don't want to acknowledge that their systems, their expectations, their habits might be causing harm, and so they prefer when the suffering is invisible. The woman who suffers silently is easy to accommodate. She fits. She doesn't demand change. She doesn't disrupt. Her suffering is seen as evidence of her strength, but really it's being used as a shield, so others don't have to look inward. It's perverse in a way. The more you quietly endure, the more you're praised. Not because you're thriving, but because your silence allows others to remain comfortable. And if you begin to unravel that illusion, if you say, I've had enough, if you cry in public, if you reject being overburdened, the reaction is often swift and punishing. You are accused of being unstable, ungrateful, a liability. So there's a psychological trap here. You're taught from a young age that approval is earned through suppression, through being easy to deal with, through not needing too much, through smiling when you want to scream. And this message is internalized deeply. It becomes a part of your identity. You start to conflate being loved with being low maintenance. You confuse acceptance with tolerance. But here's the problem. What you silence does not disappear. It festers, it grows, and eventually it transforms resentment, anxiety, depression, a sense of chronic invisibility. And you'll hear women describe this all the time. I don't feel seen. I don't feel heard. I don't know who I am anymore. That's the cost of playing a role society rewards. The mask becomes so tight you forget it's not your face. But here's where the shift can happen. When you begin to recognize that the pain of being punished for your truth is still better than the slow death of hiding it. When you decide that authenticity is worth more than approval. That discomfort, yours and others, is the price of real change. That's when something begins to awaken. You begin to test the boundaries. You begin to say what you mean. You let the mask crack. You let the emotions through. And yes, people will recoil. They won't like it at first. They may distance themselves. They may call you names. They may weaponize guilt. And that's painful, but it's also liberating because now you're not being praised for disappearing. You're not being tolerated for performing. You're standing in something real, and real is unshakable. Now, none of this means you abandon grace or kindness or empathy. But those things must come from choice, not coercion. You cannot give freely what you have been conditioned to give compulsively. There is no virtue in self-erasure. There is only exhaustion. And if we truly want a better world, one where women are not merely surviving but living, then we need to stop equating silence with strength. We need to stop rewarding compliance as if it's character. True strength is not endurance without expression. True strength is the courage to be fully human in a world that prefers masks. It's important to ask yourself, very honestly, what have I been rewarded for that is actually destroying me? What kind of woman have I been told I need to be in order to be acceptable? And who benefits from my silence? Because when you finally see it, when the pattern becomes visible, you gain something no one can take away: clarity. And with clarity comes power. You no longer bend to be accepted. You speak and you let the chips fall. And those who cannot handle your voice were never worthy of your silence in the first place. So what happens when a woman stops suffering in silence? Chaos at first, but then clarity, then liberation, then transformation. And if you're punished for speaking your truth, so be it. At least now the pain has a purpose, and that is the beginning of your power. If you really want to understand power, pay attention to what you're not allowed to say, not just out loud, but even to yourself. There are ideas you've swallowed your entire life without examining, expectations you never agreed to, roles you never chose, but somehow still play every day. And at the center of all this suppression is your voice. Not just your literal voice, but your psychological one. Your ability to say with clarity and conviction, this is who I am. This is what I need. This is what I will no longer tolerate. Owning your voice is the ultimate rebellion because it forces the world to deal with you as a subject, not as an object. It is the moment you stop being something to manage or please or label, and you become someone to reckon with. And that's precisely why the world resists it. For centuries, women have been conditioned to prioritize harmony over honesty, to smooth things over, to defer, to anticipate needs before they are expressed, to speak softly so as not to provoke, and if possible, to remain silent entirely. That conditioning doesn't disappear overnight. It lives in your nervous system. It shows up when you apologize before speaking, when you dilute your truth so it's easier to swallow, when you wait for permission to be who you already are. And here's the disturbing part. The moment you stop doing that, the moment you speak from a place of grounded clarity, not hostility, not hysteria, but sober self-respect, the environment reacts. And often, it reacts badly because you've upset the equilibrium, the unspoken deal that said, you stay small and I'll stay comfortable. So it's not just about finding your voice. It's about surviving what happens when you use it. People will say you've changed. They'll say you've become selfish, cold, dramatic, angry. But really what you've done is become visible. And people who are used to your silence will treat your self-expression as aggression because it disrupts the illusion they built around you, that you were agreeable, easygoing, quiet. But you're not here to be someone's illusion, you're here to be real. And being real is hard, especially when you've spent a lifetime being rewarded for disappearing. But the voice doesn't go away just because you bury it. It just gets twisted. It turns inward. It becomes anxiety, depression, chronic self-doubt. And what was once a natural source of power becomes a source of pain. You don't trust yourself anymore. You second guess. You shrink from confrontation. You learn to endure rather than express. And slowly, you forget that you ever had something worth saying. That's the tragedy. But the good news is that the voice can be recovered. It's not lost. It's buried under years of conditioning, people-pleasing, and fear. And the path back to it is radical honesty. You must start telling the truth, not just to others, but to yourself. What do I actually want? What am I tolerating that is slowly killing me? What conversations have I avoided out of fear? What boundaries have I erased for the sake of approval? Ask the questions. Let the answers sting. That sting is the start of resurrection, because once you start speaking from the deepest part of yourself, from your lived experience, your embodied knowing, you stop performing and start living. And it doesn't always sound polished. It might not even make sense to others. But it will feel clean, uncompromised, whole. And when you do that, something else shifts. You stop being easily manipulated. You become less reactive, harder to guilt, impossible to control. Not because you're mean or cruel or rebellious for the sake of it, but because you've anchored yourself in something deeper than fear. You've reclaimed authorship of your life. This is what narcissists, abusers, manipulators, all those who benefit from your silence, fear most. Not rage, not tears, but calm, articulate truth, delivered without apology, spoken with authority. That's what breaks the cycle. Not screaming, but saying, no, that doesn't work for me. Not begging, but saying, this is where I end and you begin. Not blaming, but saying, here's what I need. You're free to meet it or not. There's a stillness to that kind of power, a simplicity, and it's unnerving to those who rely on chaos to keep you off balance. They can't bait you. They can't shame you. They can't guilt you back into submission because you're not trying to win anymore. You're not trying to prove anything. You're just standing in truth. And truth, once spoken, doesn't beg. This is the shift that terrifies the world. A woman who speaks not to manipulate, not to impress, not to soften, but to say what is. And when one woman does that, others follow. The silence breaks, the shame dissolves, the system starts to crack. So yes, it's dangerous to own your voice. You will lose people, you will face resistance, but you will also gain something sacred: integrity, peace, wholeness. And here's the final truth. The world doesn't change when you shout louder. It changes when you speak clearly from the center of who you are and refuse to be silenced ever again.